why the 50s felt further away in the 70s than they do now. I want to start off by talking about Sha Na Na. If you're my age and you were around in the 70s, there was this show called Sha Na Na, and essentially what it was a variety show. There was singing and dancing, and essentially it was a group of these like greasers, as if they were like from the 50s. And there was Bowser, and he did this kind of stuff, and they'd wear the leather jackets and the jeans, and they'd roll off the cuffs and everything like that. And it was like homage to the 50s. And I remember there was Happy Days. Happy Days was huge back in the day, the Fonz and everything like that. There was this fascination with that time in the 70s. Grease. Grease was filmed in the 70s, but it's an homage to the 50s. Although, in my opinion, Grease feels more like the 70s than they do the 50s, but that's a whole other story. And I remember growing up and thinking, like, man, the 50s felt so far away. Like, man, that was like a whole other time. Let alone the 60s. Like the 60s felt further, like so far away too. You're talking about, the hippies and, Jefferson Airplane and the Doors and the Beatles. It just seemed like stuff from a completely different time. Fast forward to now. It's 2020 right now. And for some reason to me, the 50s don't seem that far away to me now. It doesn't really seem that far away at all to me. And it made me think, like, why is that? Like, why does the 50s now feel closer to me than they did in the 70s? Well, I have a reason. Or at least this is my theory. And I think what it has to do with the progression of how things went, I guess starting in the 50s, actually, after World War II. Once everyone came back from the war, it was a situation where people started to buy their own homes. It was people starting to buy cars. People were starting to buy their own furniture. And there was a lot of keeping up with the Joneses. There was a lot of you got to get the latest, you got to get the greatest. We're all looking forward. You don't want anything new, you want to get the new stuff. When you think of the 50s and you think of that fashion, you think of saddle shoes and poodle skirts and guys with like slick back hair and 57 Chevys and Elvis and all that other stuff. You start going into the 60s, now you're starting to get into like the Beatles, that kind of the fashion change. You start getting the beehive hairdos. Skirts got shorter, hairstyles started to change, the cars started to get a little bit more sleeker, and then you go into like the late 60s and you go into the whole hippie thing, and now everyone's growing out their hair. Going into the 70s, like people are like wearing bell bottoms and polyester. Going into disco in the 80s, now people have sideburns, and you going into the mid 80s and you get that whole new wave thing going on. Everyone was trying to look like Madonna or Cyndi Lauper or A Flock of Seagulls, and a lot of pastel colors. And then you finally get into the 90s. And I remember, like, when I think of the 90s, I think of grunge. I think of like Nirvana. I think of flannel shirts. I think of ripped jeans. I think of guys with goatees. When you start going into the mid 90s, all that changed. The change was that nothing started to change. Hairstyles started to kind of look the same. Clothing started to look the same. Furniture kind of looks the same. And fast forward to now, really honestly, when you think about it, visually, nothing really looks all that much different than it did like back in like 1999. I'll post a picture here of me, and obviously I'm younger in this thing, but I want you to look at this picture, and I want you to try to guess when this picture was taken. Are you ready for the answer? The answer is 2003. But obviously what I'm wearing and how everything is, that could have been taken like 10 years ago. I think because essentially things have kind of stayed the same as far as fashion is concerned, or cars or architecture, God, even music for that matter. I mean, I think grunge was like the last true new form of music to come out. Yeah, actually, I think it is because it's like when you start. I was trying to think of like maybe like a band like the White Stripes or the Strokes or something like that. But essentially, that's rock and roll. They're doing like garage rock. They're just pulling from like old influences. But I really honestly think once you get past the mid '90s, things started to just kind of stay the same. And then you have YouTube and the internet. And now you can go on YouTube and you can find clips of bands playing from any decade. You got all types of music. There's actually like news reports, there's commercials. Like say if you're into the 50s or say if you're into the 60s or even the 40s, there's tons of content out there that you can watch online or even read about or even pictures. I mean, you can go crazy looking at pictures from like any decade. Well, back in the 80s or the 70s, you didn't have the internet. If you saw anything, maybe it was in an encyclopedia. Just I think the distance, it felt further away because it felt more closed off from, like you were cut off from the past back then. And one thing that I started to see in the 90s was retro culture started to take effect. I remember that's when like the squirrel knit zippers were starting to get big. You had the Brian Setzer Orchestra. You had rockabilly. You had a lot of people starting to dress up retro and vintage. There was a lot of swing dancing going on. And up until that point, there wasn't a lot of people that were really, really into that. So if there was any connection to the 50s or the 60s, it was underground. It was very, very underground. As far as culture was concerned of the 70s or the 80s, that was just the past. We are all about pushing things forward until you start getting into the mid-90s. With the help of things just kind of being the same and the internet and YouTube, the 50s and the 60s don't seem that far away now. And I think that's a good thing because there's a lot of great music from that time. There's a lot of great fashion. There's a lot of awesome cars. And let's embrace the future by embracing the past.